in the bustling heart of the Dutch Republic during its golden age, the world was literally at the feet of the Calvinists. Imagine a time when maps were not just pieces of paper but gateways to uncharted lands, where every ship that set sail carried the promise of discovery and the spread of faith. This was the 1600s, a time when the Netherlands was not just a nation but a bridge between the old and the new, a hub of global commerce and intellectual curiosity. Picture the city of Amsterdam, with its bustling markets and narrow, canal-lined streets. Merchants from all over the world converged here, bringing with them tales of far-off lands and exotic cultures. Writers like Alfred Dapper and Arnold Montanus filled books with descriptions of the customs and practices of people in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Artists like Romain Duhou and Theodore Dubray sketched images that brought these distant lands to life, while cartographers like Abraham Ortelius and Jodocus Hondius mapped the world, charting the paths of exploration and adventure. But among all this excitement, there was a serious mission at hand. The Calvinists, a strict and devout group of Protestants, were not just content with exploring the world. They wanted to change it. For them, the globe was a vast mission field, and their goal was to convert as many people as possible to their faith. This was no small task, but they were determined to see it through. At the heart of this mission were the universities of Utrecht and Leiden, where theologians like Gisbertus Voetius and Johannes Hornbeck dedicated their lives to the study of missions. Voetius, in particular, was a driving force behind the global spread of Calvinism. He had learned Arabic, lectured on Islam, and written extensively about the methods of conversion. His approach was simple, yet profound. Build church communities, educate the locals, and live among them to show the way of God. The challenges were immense. In the Moluccan Islands, Batavia, now Jakarta, Formosa, now Taiwan, and Brazil, Calvinist ministers faced resistance from local rulers, military commanders, and merchant leaders. Sometimes, these leaders were more interested in profit than in the spread of the gospel. Voetius was frustrated by this, but he remained steadfast in his belief that the church, not the trading companies, should control the missions. One of the most significant challenges was the question of how to convert people from different cultures and religions. Should the requirements for baptism and communion be the same for everyone, or should they be adapted to local customs? Boetius and his colleagues debated this issue, and their discussions influenced the way missions were carried out around the world. In the Netherlands, the rise of rationalist thinkers like René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza added a new layer of complexity. These philosophers questioned traditional religious beliefs and challenged the Calvinists to defend their faith with reason and logic. The Calvinists, in turn, used their global experiences to inform their debates, drawing parallels between the struggles against rationalism in Europe and the challenges of converting pagans and Muslims overseas. The global mission of the Calvinists was not just a religious endeavor. It was a cultural and intellectual movement that shaped the way people in the Dutch Republic understood the world. The images and stories that flowed back from the mission fields inspired artists, writers, and thinkers, creating a rich tapestry of global knowledge. As the 17th century progressed, the Calvinists' mission continued to evolve. They sent learned men to Japan and China, where the intellectual achievements of these civilizations required a more sophisticated approach. They established schools and seminaries to train young men for the task of spreading the gospel. They wrote books and gave lectures, sharing their experiences and insights with a growing audience. The global Calvinist mission was a testament to the power of faith and the human spirit. It was a time when the world was shrinking, and the Netherlands was at the center of it all. The Calvinists were not just explorers. They were pioneers of a new global order, one that would shape the future in ways they could only begin to imagine. Dutch Calvinists in the 17th century were deeply involved in spreading their faith across the world. They saw their mission as part of a divine plan where every event, no matter how big or small, had a purpose. This belief shaped how they understood and responded to the world around them. In Amsterdam, Walcheren, and other parts of the Netherlands, the church leaders or classes regularly received letters from missionaries in far-off places like Batavia, in modern-day Indonesia, Formosa, now Taiwan, Amboina, Banda, Ternate, Colombo, in Sri Lanka, the Cape of Good Hope, in South Africa, Brazil, New Netherland, in North America, Curacao, and Suriname. These letters described the state of the missions and the challenges they faced. Reading and discussing these reports helped the Dutch ministers see how their faith was doing in different parts of the world. They believed that God was guiding the spread of their religion, and they used these stories to understand a bigger picture of God's plan. For example, Godefridus, Udemans, and Hugo Grotius saw the discovery of the Indies as part of God's plan to spread the gospel. Udemans wrote in 1638 that the Lord wishes to show that now the time has come that the gospel of the kingdom should be preached throughout the entire world. This belief gave them a sense of purpose and direction. When something significant happened, the Dutch Calvinists saw it as a sign from God. In 1693, Samuel Tredzel, a secretary for Indian Affairs, wrote to the Batavia consistory about a plot by the French king to kill Stadtouder Willem III. When the plot was foiled, Tredzel saw it as God's protection for their country. He also mentioned an earthquake in the Netherlands, which he and others saw as a divine judgment. They believed that God was sending messages through natural events, and it was their job to understand these messages. Calvinists often use stories from the Bible and church history to explain what was happening in their missions. For instance, when a Dutch community in Albany, New York was struggling, the Amsterdam classis reminded them of St. Paul's patience. Paul wanted to go to heaven, but stayed on earth to help new Christians grow. This story was meant to encourage the community to stay strong and patient. In South Asia, a minister used the story of St. Thomas, who was the first to bring Christianity to India, to explain why some Christians there had strayed from the true faith. He said that over time, Roman Catholic missionaries had influenced these communities, leading them astray. In Colombo, the consistory compared new converts who joined for worldly reasons to the new Christians in the Roman Empire, who joined after the emperors supported the religion. When the Dutch lost Formosa to the Chinese, they were very sad. A writer from Holland used the story of Naomi from the book of Ruth to express their feelings. Naomi was sad because she had lost everything and felt abandoned by God. The writer compared this to the loss of Formosa, saying that the once beautiful land was now desolate and abandoned by God. Dutch Calvinists often compared themselves to the children of Israel, who faced many challenges but were always protected by God. In 1682, the Amsterdam classis took comfort in the long suffering of the Israelites, who were always delivered by God. In 1786, the Predikanten in Batavia offered prayers for the rebuilding of Solomon's Temple, hoping that the Dutch Republic, which they called Dutch Jerusalem, would also be rebuilt after being attacked by France. The Dutch saw their mission as a continuation of the work started by the apostles. They believed that the Reformation was a movement to bring the church back to the true faith, and they were extending this work through their missions. In 1675, the Amsterdam classis gave thanks for the work of the ministers in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and for the spread of the faith in the Netherlands. In 1720, the Colombo consistory rejoiced in the preaching of the Word of God around the world. While the Dutch were spreading their faith abroad, they also had to deal with threats at home. Catholicism was a big concern. Even though Catholics were allowed to worship privately, Calvinists feared that the rise of the Jesuits and the aggression of Catholic France could undermine their efforts. They called for stricter rules against Catholic worship and wrote many articles attacking the Catholic faith. Another threat came from rationalism, which was becoming popular among some Protestants. Rationalists believed that human reason was the best way to understand the world, including religion. This was a problem for Calvinists, who believed that only the Bible could reveal God's truth. They saw rationalism as a dangerous path that could lead to atheism. The rise of Cartesian philosophy, based on the ideas of René Descartes, also worried the Calvinists. Descartes suggested that human reason should be the basis for understanding religion and nature. For Calvinists, like Voetius, this was a form of atheism because it put human reason above God's revelation in the Bible. The tension between Calvinism and Cartesianism led to heated debates, especially over issues like the interpretation of the Bible and the observance of the Sabbath. One of the most significant debates was between Voetius and Cocasius. Voetius believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible, while Cocasius argued that some parts of the Bible, especially from the Old Testament, should be understood symbolically. For example, Cocasius said that the command to keep the Sabbath no longer applied after Christ's coming. This debate highlighted the challenges of interpreting the Bible in a meaningful way, and kept the issue of rationalism and skepticism alive among Calvinists for many years. The global mission also gave Calvinists a new way to understand the religious struggles at home. They began to see their European enemies, such as Catholics and rationalists, in the same light as the pagans they encountered in their missions. By the 1640s, Calvinists were using the term paganism to describe any beliefs or practices that they saw as false or dangerous. This helped them explain and critique the religious and intellectual challenges they faced in Europe. The great theologian Gisbertus Voetius was a key figure in this process. He used the global mission to understand and combat the threats to Calvinism in Europe. By comparing the beliefs of pagans in distant lands to those of their enemies at home, Calvinists like Voetius were able to see the bigger picture of God's plan and their role in it. This global perspective gave Dutch Calvinists a deeper understanding of their faith and the world around them. They saw their mission as part of a divine plan, and they used this belief to navigate the challenges they faced both at home and abroad. Voetius, a Dutch theologian, held a very broad view of what he considered atheism. To him, atheism wasn't just the explicit denial of God, but also any belief that blurred the lines between God and nature. This meant that anyone who didn't accept the Christian God as the supreme transcendent creator was, in Voetius's eyes, an atheist. This included many different groups within Europe, such as the Libertines, Socinians, and Cartesians, as well as people from other religious traditions like pagans, Muslims, and Jews. Voetius argued that these groups, by attributing divine qualities to nature or reducing God to a part of nature, were essentially denying the true nature of God. In his disputations, Voetius compared these European groups to the pagans of ancient and contemporary times. He believed that pagans, who often worshipped natural elements, were the quintessential example of atheists. He saw a direct link between the worship of nature and the denial of the true God. Voetius's view was that if someone worshipped nature or reason instead of the true God, they were in essence atheists. This perspective allowed him to lump together a wide range of groups from ancient pagans to modern European rationalists under the umbrella of atheism. Voetius and other Calvinist thinkers, like Georgius Hornius and Simon Umius, also drew connections between these European rationalists and other religious groups outside Europe. Hornius, for example, suggested that if Socinians were pagans, they were at least more intelligent than the ancient heathens. He warned that European rationalists were on a path toward Turkdom and atheism, implying that their beliefs were similar to those of Muslims. Wulmius went further, claiming that the anti-Trinitarian beliefs of Socinians were influenced by Muslim teachings. He even suggested that some prominent Dutch thinkers, like Hugo Grotius and Johannes Utenbogart, had sympathies with these non-Christian beliefs. The Calvinists' long-standing critique of Catholicism also fit into this broader narrative. Since the Reformation, Protestants had often accused Catholics of practicing pagan idolatry. They saw the use of religious images and ceremonies in Catholic worship as a form of idolatry similar to the practices of ancient pagans. This critique was not just a European issue. It extended to the mission fields, where Calvinist clergy saw Catholic influence as a double threat, both reinforcing old pagan beliefs and introducing new forms of idolatry. As the 17th century progressed, the Calvinists' engagement with global religious practices provided them with new perspectives on the rationalist movements in Europe. When Socinians and other rationalists began to gain influence in the Netherlands, Calvinists used their experiences with paganism to critique these new ideas. They saw the same error in rationalist thinking that they had identified in pagan worship. The confusion between the created world and the creator. For example, the Amsterdam classes warned that the ideas of philosophers like Willem Doerhoff, who blended Christian and rationalist beliefs, were leading people toward a form of idolatry that could be particularly appealing to indigenous population. The Calvinists' global missions also influenced their thinking. They saw the world as a vast, interconnected network of religious practices, all of which could be compared and analyzed. This comparative approach helped them understand the threats posed by rationalist and heterodox groups in Europe. For instance, they saw the idolatry of Hindu traditions in South Asia as similar to the errors of rationalist thinkers who ascribed divine qualities to nature. In the late 17th century, the Dutch Reformed Church's global reach brought a new dimension to their theological debates. The missions in places like the Indies and Brazil provided a wealth of information about different religious practices which the Calvinists used to refine their arguments against rationalism and other heretical beliefs. They saw the world as a great looking glass that reflected the effects of sin, grace, and faith. This global perspective helped them to better understand and combat the intellectual and religious challenges they faced at home. The intellectual and cultural transformations of the 17th century allowed thinkers to use knowledge of the wider world to reflect on European society. Intellectuals like René Descartes, Jean Bernard, and Bernard Picard used comparisons with other cultures to critique and improve European institutions and beliefs. Montesquieu, in his Persian letters, used fictional Iranian travelers to offer sharp social commentary on France. Voltaire praised Confucian philosophy as a model for a more humane and rational society. Similarly, within the Dutch Reformed Church, thinkers like Georgius Hornius and Isaac Vossius debated the value of Confucian thought for creating a more tolerant and rational European society. The global perspective provided by the missions and the intellectual exchanges of the time gave Calvinists a powerful tool to understand and critique the rationalist and heterodox movements in Europe. By drawing on their experiences with paganism and other religious traditions, they could see these European movements as part of a broader global struggle to maintain the purity of Christian doctrine. This comparative approach not only shaped their theological debates, but also influenced their mission strategies and their understanding of the world. Pierre Bayle, a famous French thinker, fled to the Dutch Republic in 1681 to escape religious persecution. He lived in Rotterdam until he died in 1706. Bayle was a complex figure. He called himself a follower of John Calvin, but many of his ideas were seen as controversial, even by his fellow Calvinists. Some thought he was an atheist, while others saw him as a skeptic with a strong moral compass. Despite his mixed reputation, Bayle's work deeply influenced the intellectual life of the Dutch Republic. Bale didn't speak Dutch, but he was very involved in the debates happening around him. He read and wrote in French, which many educated Dutch people understood. He stayed in touch with many Dutch Calvinist thinkers and was well respected for his ideas. One of his most famous works, The Historical and Critical Dictionary, was a massive book that explored all sorts of topics, from history to philosophy. Bale used his writing to challenge religious dogmatism and intolerance. He often compared European practices with those from other parts of the world to show that many of the things Europeans took for granted were not unique or necessarily better. For example, he pointed out that the Turks, who were Muslims, often showed more tolerance toward other religions than Christians did. Bale used stories from missionaries and travelers to show that many non-European societies had their own moral and spiritual practices which sometimes mirrored those in Europe. Bale was critical of Christian missionaries, especially the Jesuits, who he thought were too aggressive in their efforts to convert people. He argued that if the Ottoman Sultan sent missionaries to Europe to convert Christians to Islam, it would cause the same kind of social disruption that European missionaries caused in other lands. Bale believed that religious intolerance was just as cruel and barbarous in Europe as it was anywhere else in the world. He also used examples from around the globe to show that people everywhere were capable of superstition and idolatry. For instance, he pointed out that Europeans, despite their Christianity, often believed in omens and astrology, just like people in other parts of the world. Bale argued that the devil used similar tricks to mislead people, no matter where they lived. Bale's work was part of a broader trend in the Dutch Republic, where thinkers were using global perspectives to reflect on their own religious and philosophical beliefs. One of these thinkers was Adrian Rieland, a Calvinist scholar who wrote a balanced and non-polemical book about Islam in 1705. Rieland was frustrated that Dutch traders were more interested in making money than in spreading Christianity. He believed that understanding other religions was essential for the Christian mission. Rieland's work on Islam was groundbreaking because it was one of the first to treat the religion with respect and without the usual condemnations. His book became influential among European intellectuals, helping to reshape how people thought about religion and its role in society. Another Dutch thinker, Abraham Hyodianus, who was influenced by Cartesian philosophy, argued that idolatry was more prevalent in Europe than in other parts of the world. He believed that the practices of pagans in Asia, Africa, and the Americas were less harmful than the idolatry found in European Christianity. These thinkers, including Bales, Rieland, and Hyodianus, used their knowledge of the wider world to challenge and expand the intellectual and religious debates of their time. They showed that by looking beyond Europe, one could gain new insights into the nature of belief and the human condition. Their work reflected the growing global perspective of the Dutch Republic and its impact on European thought. Andreas Wissewacius and Antonius van Dale were two men who lived in the 17th century. They shared a common belief that the Catholic Church in Europe was not much different from the pagan priests of ancient times. These pagan priests kept the secrets of their religion from their people, and Wissewacius and Van Dale thought the Catholic Church did the same thing. Wissewacius was a Socinian, which means he belonged to a religious group that rejected some traditional Christian beliefs. He wrote annotations for a book called The Open Door by Abraham Rogerius. In his writings, Wissewacius argued that the Catholic Church relied too much on ancient pagan ideas and complicated philosophy, instead of following the simple teachings of the Bible. He believed that if they wanted to convince people like deists, heathens, Jews, and Muslims to become Christians, they should use clear and straightforward arguments from the Bible, not complex theories. Van Dale, on the other hand, was a Mennonite minister, which means he belonged to a different religious group that emphasized a simpler, more community-based form of Christianity. He wrote several books about ancient pagan practices, like idolatry and divination. He was particularly interested in how pagan priests tricked people into believing in myths and miracles. Van Dale believed that these practices were still happening in his time, even in Europe. He wrote that the belief in the devil was a human invention, and that some pagan prophecies had spread from ancient Greece to other parts of the world, including Asia and the Middle East. One of the most controversial books of the time was The Enchanted World by Balthasar Bekker, a Reformed minister in Amsterdam. Becker's book challenged the common belief in witchcraft and the devil. He argued that what people thought was witchcraft was actually just pagan superstition. Bekker believed that the devil wasn't as powerful as people thought, and that the idea of a powerful devil was more of a myth than a reality. Becker's book caused a lot of trouble. The Calvinist Church, which was very influential in Amsterdam, strongly disagreed with his ideas. They considered his book heretical and eventually expelled him from the church. Despite this, the book became very popular and was translated into several languages. Becker's arguments were supported by other Protestant thinkers, like Van Dale and Johannes Dewey Jarius. Bekker based his arguments on a global perspective. He read about the religious practices of people from all over the world, including Asia, Africa, and the Americas. He used these examples to show that many of the beliefs and practices that Europeans called witchcraft were actually common in other cultures. For example, he wrote about the religious practices of the Javanese and the beliefs of the Sinhalese in Ceylon. He argued that these practices were not evidence of the devil's power, but were simply part of the cultural and religious traditions of these people. Becker's work was part of a larger debate about the nature of religion and the role of the devil. Many Christians, especially Calvinists, believed that the devil was active in the world, particularly in non-Christian societies. They thought that the devil was responsible for the idol worship and pagan practices they saw in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Bekker, however, saw these practices as human inventions and superstitions, not the work of an evil supernatural being. Becker's ideas were controversial because they challenged deeply held beliefs about the devil and witchcraft. Many people, especially those in the church, were offended by his claims. However, his work also opened up new ways of thinking about religion and the world. By looking at the religious practices of different cultures, Bekker showed that many of the things Europeans considered supernatural or evil were actually part of a broader human experience. This global perspective helped people see their own beliefs and practices in a new light. Jacob Coleman, a strict Calvinist clergyman, was one of the most vocal critics of Balthasar Bekker. Bekker, a Dutch philosopher and theologian, had written several works that challenged traditional Calvinist beliefs, especially on the existence of the devil and the supernatural. Coleman was particularly upset by Becker's ideas and wrote a treatise in 1692 to counter them. He accused Bekker of being influenced by pagan and Cartesian, followers of René Descartes, ideas which Coleman considered dangerous and heretical. Coleman argued that Bekker was misinterpreting God's clear teachings about the spiritual world and morality which all Christians should accept. He believed that Bekker was making Christian teachings sound like pagan beliefs, which was unacceptable. Coleman also claimed that Bekker thought true Christians, who understood the Bible as the straightforward truth, were actually bewitched or misled. In Coleman's view, Bekker was suggesting that Calvinists who were strict Christians were the real devil worshippers. Coleman didn't stop there. He grouped Bekker with other groups that Calvinists strongly opposed, like atheists, libertines, and Spinozists. He accused Bekker of having sympathy for pagan practices and failing to recognize the evil in pagan worship. Coleman believed that Becker and his followers were thinking of God in a way that was too natural and physical, which was far from the transcendent God of Christianity. Another critic of Becker was Johannes van der Weyden, a theologian from Franeker. In a pamphlet published in 1696, van der Weyden mocked Becker for thinking that Christians could find truth in pagan stories. He argued that pagans believed they were praying to demons, and Becker's rejection of the devil's existence meant he couldn't see this. Van der Weyden saw Becker's views as similar to those of the Socinians, a group that denied many traditional Christian beliefs, including the existence of the devil, the nature of God, and the divine creation of the world. The controversy over Becker's ideas was not just about rationalism in Protestant thinking. It was also about how Calvinists and other Protestants viewed people and cultures outside of Europe. For many years, Calvinists had been observing and interacting with people from different parts of the world, and these interactions were changing their perspectives. The debate over Becker's ideas was a reflection of these changing views. In the 1680s, we see another example of how these changing views played out in the Dutch East Indies. In Negapatnam on the Coromandel coast, a Dutch merchant named Jacob Jorisune Pits attended a local function where traditional Hindu dancers performed. These dances, called Bharatanatyam, were often part of religious ceremonies and were performed in temples. In Europe, Calvinists strongly opposed dancing, especially in religious contexts, and they often called the performers dancing prostitutes. When Johannes Ruderus, the local Reformed minister, found out that Pits and other church members had attended this event, he was outraged. He censured them, suspended them from communion, and even resigned his position. This caused a conflict with the Dutch East India Company, BOC, which saw the event as a necessary part of doing business in a local culture. Ruderus wrote to the church authorities in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and the Synod of South Holland for advice. He asked if it was okay for church members to watch these dances, if they should be allowed to take communion, if a censured member could witness a baptism, and if a minister could resign over such a moral issue. The response from Batavia was surprising. The church leaders there said that the dances were not sinful, but were part of local culture. They argued that the VOC needed to conduct business in pagan lands, and the company was also helping to spread Christianity. Since Pits and the others had done nothing wrong, the church should not punish them. The Batavian leaders thought Ruderus had overreacted and resigned too quickly. The Synod of South Holland, however, agreed with Ruderus. They condemned the dances as devilish and the performers as prostitutes. They also criticized the corruption in the churches in the East Indies and called on the VOC to uphold discipline. This conflict showed a significant shift in attitudes. For many years, Calvinists had seen practices like dancing and images as diabolical. But after decades of interacting with different cultures, some Reformed clergy began to see these practices as harmless customs rather than religious rituals. These changes in perspective were not limited to the East Indies. Calvinist ministers and theologians in the Dutch Republic were also being influenced by their interactions with people from around the world. They began to see similarities in religious practices and beliefs across different cultures, which led some to question the traditional Calvinist view of the devil and the supernatural. The missionary efforts of the Dutch Reformed Church were also changing. In the late 1700s, a new pietistic movement emerged, emphasizing personal faith and a more evangelical approach to missions. This movement sought to fund missions independently and free missionaries from colonial constraints. The Dutch Missionary Society, founded in 1797, was part of this new vision. The legacy of global Calvinism, shaped by these interactions and changes, was complex. It reflected the tensions between traditional Calvinist orthodoxy and the new ideas and experiences that came from encounters with different cultures. These changes not only influenced the Reformed Church, but also contributed to the broader globalization of Dutch society in the 17th and 18th centuries. Calvinism, a branch of Christianity, spread far beyond the borders of Europe, intertwining with the vast commercial networks of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the West India Company, WIC. This expansion meant that Calvinism was not just a European religion, but a global one, influencing and being influenced by the diverse cultures it encountered. In places like Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Formosa, now Taiwan, the East Indies, now Indonesia, the Cape of Good Hope, now South Africa, and Brazil, Calvinist missionaries worked to spread their faith. They built churches, preached in local languages, and translated religious texts. These efforts often involved working closely with indigenous people who became teachers, linguists, and church leaders. For example, in Ceylon, Tamil and Sinhalese teachers helped spread Calvinist teachings, while in the East Indies, Malay speakers translated sermons and catechisms. However, the relationship between Calvinist missionaries and the local populations was complex. While the missionaries aimed to convert people to their faith, they also had to navigate the social and political dynamics of colonial life. They often collaborated with company officials who needed the church's help to manage the colonies. This collaboration sometimes led to conflicts. For instance, missionaries wanted to enforce strict moral codes and ban other religions, but company officials often favored a more tolerant approach to maintain peace and order. The missionaries' strategies for conversion were rooted in the idea of building religious communities. They believed that conversion was not just about individual belief, but about becoming part of a community with shared values and practices. To achieve this, they focused on three main areas: community formation, language, and education. Community formation. Calvinists aimed to create cohesive religious communities where people lived according to biblical teachings and moral discipline. This meant setting up churches, schools, and other institutions that reinforced these values. For example, in Batavia, now Jakarta, the church played a central role in social life, from managing poor relief to overseeing marriages. Language. Recognizing the importance of communication, Calvinist missionaries worked with local linguists to translate religious texts into languages like Malay, Tamil, Sinhalese, and Tupian. These translations were crucial for spreading the gospel and making it accessible to people who spoke different languages. Education. Schools were a key tool for indoctrinating the young. Missionaries believed that educating children in Calvinist principles would ensure the long-term survival of the faith. These schools taught not only religious subjects, but also practical skills, helping to integrate converts into the broader colonial society. Despite these efforts, large-scale conversion was challenging. Calvinists often clashed with local customs and beliefs, making it difficult for people to fully embrace the new religion. For many, the benefits of joining a Calvinist community, such as access to education, employment, and social support, were outweighed by the risks of abandoning their traditional ways of life. Conversion also carried social and political consequences, such as alienation from family and community. By the mid-18th century, Calvinist expectations for widespread conversion had dimmed. The strict criteria for becoming a full member of the church, including adherence to moral and theological standards, made it hard for many to join. This rigidity often led to skepticism about the authenticity of conversions, which in turn made it harder to build lasting religious communities. The global reach of Calvinism had a profound impact on the religion itself. The encounters with diverse cultures and beliefs led to a more complex and nuanced understanding of the world. Calvinists began to see false religions as part of a long history of idolatry and superstition, which they traced back to the biblical fall. This perspective helped them understand the challenges of missions and the diverse forms of belief they encountered. The study of non-Christian religions, such as Islam and Hinduism, also influenced Calvinist thought. Scholars like Adrian Roland provided detailed and relatively neutral accounts of these religions, which were used to argue for the superiority of Christianity. This knowledge, however, also contributed to a more comparative and relativistic view of world religions, a trend that continued into the Enlightenment. In the end, the global missions of Calvinism had a significant impact on both the colonial world and the Netherlands itself. The struggles and successes of these missions shaped the way Calvinists understood their faith and its place in the world, leading to a more global and diverse perspective on religion and culture. The story of Protestant intellectuals in the Netherlands during the second half of the 17th century is a fascinating tale of how global interactions shaped their thinking and religious beliefs. At this time, the Netherlands was a major player in world trade and exploration, and Dutch merchants and missionaries traveled to places like Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These travels exposed them to a wide range of cultures and religions, which in turn influenced their views on Christianity and the world around them. Some of the leading figures in this period were Orthodox Calvinists, like Gisbertus Voetius and Jacob Colman. They were deeply concerned about the spread of what they saw as dangerous ideas, such as those from Descartes, Socinus, and Spinoza. These thinkers, whom Voetius and Colman called libertines, often emphasized human reason and individual freedom, which Voetius and Colman believed could lead to idolatry and atheism. For them, elevating human reason to the level of the divine was a serious sin. However, not all Calvinists shared this view. Some, like Jacob Vischer, Adrian Roland, and François Valentine, became more open-minded through their interactions with other cultures. They started to see practices that were once considered diabolical as simply cultural artifacts. For example, they might view religious dances or Islamic rituals as part of a people's heritage rather than as inherently evil. This shift in perspective was partly due to the fact that they spent a lot of time in these regions and became more familiar with local customs. Another group, including Balthasar Bekker and Pierre Bayle, took a more radical approach. They began to question the existence of miracles and supernatural forces altogether. Bekker, in his book, The Enchanted World, argued that many of the supernatural phenomena people believed in were actually natural events that could be explained by science. Bayle, in his Historical and Critical Dictionary, encouraged people to think critically and question traditional religious beliefs. What's interesting is that these developments in the Netherlands were not isolated. They were part of a larger global conversation. The ideas and debates that emerged in the Netherlands were influenced by, and in turn influenced similar discussions happening in other parts of the world. This shows that the Enlightenment, often seen as a distinctly Western movement, was actually a global phenomenon. Some key figures and their works played crucial roles in these discussions. For example, Philippus Baldaeus wrote about the idolatry of East Indian pagans, while Gisbertus Voetius wrote extensively on atheism and different religious practices. Other notable works include Johannes Kochias's oration on the religion of the Turks and Adrian Roland's detailed study of Islam. The Dutch East India Company, BOC, also played a significant role in these interactions. The company sent missionaries to different parts of the world, and the letters and reports they sent back provided valuable insights into the cultures and religions they encountered. These documents are now stored in various archives in the Netherlands and other countries, and they offer a rich source of information for historians. In the end, the story of these Protestant intellectuals shows how global interactions can lead to new ways of thinking and understanding the world. It reminds us that no culture or religion exists in isolation, and that the exchange of ideas can have profound and lasting effects.